Good evening, everyone. So tonight we're going to talk all about overproduction, predictability or selectivity, and second language processing. So overproduction basically pertains to a learner that produces a given second language structure with much greater frequency than natives of second language do. So some structures that are not so frequent in the target language are used more regularly by the learner. Why? Okay, this is because the learner feels more confident using them and therefore overproduction will arise. Not only do we find these are different paths of development, but we also find quantitatively different uses of forms depending on the native language. So, Scatchter and Rutherford 1979 examined compositions written in English by Chinese and Japanese speakers. Both of these languages are the type that relies heavily on the concept of topic, so sentences are organized around a topic comment structure. So in this topic comment structure, the person presents information and then makes that information either a statement or a question by adding a comment. So please take note that English does not use topic comment sentence structure because it is only done by non-English speakers. For example, the Chinese or Japanese speakers to arrange a sentence. So, for example, in this sentence, as for meat, the topic, then we don't eat it anymore, which is the comment. So, in this sentence, they put the topic at the beginning of the sentence and then follow with the comment about the topic. So, the topic of sentence is essentially just what the sentence is about, and of course, the comment is what is being said about the topic. What Scatchter and Rutherford found was an overproduction of sentences like the following. It is very unfortunate that, and sentences with there is or there are. There is a small restaurant near my house and my country. Many things of the restaurant are like those. They claim that these sentences were being used to carry the weight of a particular discourse function, even though the target language makes use of the other forms for that same function. They hypothesize that the native language is at play here. There is an influence of native language function, the need to express the topic comment type structures to second language form. So Han 2000 further investigated that this structure is supporting earlier research claiming that this structure, which she refers to as pseudo-passive, becomes more like a target-like passive as learners becomes more syntactically sophisticated. So when we say pseudo-passive, it pertains to a verb construction that has a passive form but either an active meaning or no grammatically active equivalent. So, um, Han examined spontaneous writing of two Chinese learners of English, advanced proficiency, finding both a true passive and a structure that looks more like a topic comment structure in the same writing, which is um which is shown in this sentence. They told me that the attractive offer will be sent to me a bit later since what I sent to them have not received. So in this sentence, the first part of the sentence includes a target like passive, whereas the second part, what I sent to them, which is the topic, and have not received, is the comment is more like first language like. What is noteworthy, however, is that the first part of the sentence may be somewhat formalic and may have been used as a formalic chunk from a letter the writer had received. Clearly, This example shows that the first language exerts a subtle influence even at the later stages of proficiency. Predictability or selectivity. So it is when something in second language is very different from the first language. There is a novelty effect and the information sticks more rapidly. So when we say novelty effect, it occurs when the results of a study are due to the newness of the treatment. So in the late 1970s, interest in the role of the native language shed its earlier dichotomous perspective and took on a when and under what conditions perspective. That is, the question was, under what conditions does transfer takes place? Anderson, 1983, developed the transfer to somewhere principle, which stated that a grammatical form or structure will occur consistently and to a significant extent in interlanguage as a result of transfer if and only if there already exists within the second language input the potential for misgeneralization from the input to produce the same form or structure. So this principle is developed to account for when transfer is likely to occur. So basically, it claims that transfer will occur only in those instances when the second language input allows the learner to see potential for transfer. This proposal has limitations. For example, this is limited to syntax and there is little possibility of disproving it because the potential must be in the mind of the learner and it is difficult to show that there was no potential at all. But it does contribute to the discussion in which the learner and his or her perceptions rather than merely language are at the center. The notion underlying contrastive analysis that similarities implied learning ease and that differences implied learning difficulty proved to be invalid. Kleinman, 1977, suggested the opposite. When something in the second language is very different from the first language, there is a novelty effect. In his study, this was the case with the progressive, which is absent in Arabic, yet Arabic speakers learn this early and well. It may be that frequency of the progressive in English, along with its perceptual saliency, leads learners to notice that structure more easily than other structures. Supporting comes from Bardovi-Harlig, 1987. She examined differences in the order of acquisition between sentences like "Who did John give the book to?" and "To whom did John give the book?" So when you say order of acquisition, it pertains to a concept in language acquisition describing the specific order in which all language learners acquire the grammatical features of their first language. Basically, this concept is based on the observation that all children acquire their first language in a fixed, universal order regardless of the specific grammatical structure of the language they learned. So theoretical considerations based on markedness. When you say markedness, closed set of possibilities within a linguistic system where the given possibilities rank from the simplest and most frequent among languages of the world to the most complex and rarest. So that is when um, the markedness predict the acquisition of to whom did John give the book before who did John give the book to. However, the data show the reverse pattern. Who did John give the book to is acquired before to whom did John give the book. Bardovi-Horleg identified salience as the main contributing factor to the unexpected outcome. In her term, salience is defined as the availability of input. It is because there is a greater quantity of input for sentences such as who did John give the book to as opposed to whom did John give the book, to which learners are exposed that acquisition patterns are what they are. Salience and second language acquisition receive greater support from Doughty 1991 in a study of relativization. So when you say relativization, it is the process of forming a relative clause. So relative clause are clauses starting with a relative pronouns such as who, that, which, whose, where, or when. They are most often used to define or identify the noun that precedes them. So please take note that relative clause is a dependent clause, which means that it has a subject and a verb, but it cannot stand alone as a sentence. So, Doughty compared three groups of subjects engaged in a computer-assisted language learning project. The groups differed in the format of presentation of the language material. Besides a control group, there were two experimental groups, which are meaning-oriented treatment group and rule-oriented treatment group. As the name suggests, in the latter group, there was explicit metalinguistic statements about relative clauses, whereas in the meaning-oriented treatment group, there were no such explicit statements. If it is correct that salience can come about through focusing a learner's attention on particular grammatical features, then one would expect that the rule-oriented treatment group would do better on a post-test than the other two groups. This was not the case. The two experimental groups improved more or less equally. However, a closer examination of the experimental materials brings back to the question of salience and what is that makes something salient. There are many ways in which increased salience can be brought about. Among this is frequency of input. So form focus instruction is yet another. Although there is a caution, studies cannot, in absolute terms, determine how externally manipulating salience impacts what happens in a learner's head. So let's go back to the Doughty study. We see that both saliency and redundancy were built into the tasks of the meaning-oriented treatment group. In the experimental material, this group saw reading passages with certain features, namely head nouns and relative clause markers. Okay. So additionally, there was typographical capitalization of the juxtaposed head noun and relative clause marker, thereby visually making this part of the reading passage salient to the learner. Thus, if salience has important role in second language acquisition, then Doughty's results are what would be predicted, as both forms of pedagogical intervention focus on drawing learners' attention to relative clause formation. Thus, as Kleinman suggested, some first language, second language differences may prove to be relatively easy to learn due to their saliency and the second language input. In a similar vein, Ringbaum 1987 pointed out that similarities may obscure for the learner the fact that there is something to learn. Aller and Ziahosany 1970 suggested that learning is the most difficult where the most subtle distinctions are required either between the target and native language or within the target language. So both Ringbaum and Aller and Ziahosany views are consistent with placing the learner rather than just the learner's language at the center. How the learner relates the first to the second language is of primary importance in understanding how second language learning is affected by knowledge of the first language. So, one of the most interesting proposals in the area of cross linguistic influences was that made of Kellerman. So, basic to his view of the role of the native language is the learner's perception of the distance between the first and the second languages. So, the significance of his work and other work of the time from other linguists is the attempt to place the study of transfer or cross-linguistic influences within a cognitive domain, thereby discrediting the implicit assumption of the necessary relationship between transfer and behaviorism. So, in this view, the learner is seen as making decisions about which forms and functions of the native language are appropriate candidates for use in the second language. So, the constraints on language transfer transcend the linguistic boundaries of similarity or dissimilarity of the native and target languages and encompass as a major variable the learner's decision-making processes relating to the potential transferability of linguistic elements. So this is not to say that similarity or dissimilarity dimensions are irrelevant, for clearly this is not actually the case. Considerations of similarity or dissimilarity are central to a learner's decision-making processes. So, in Kellerman's framework, linguistic information is categorized along a continuum ranging from language-neutral information to language-specific information. So, what is meant by this? Language neutral items are those items a learner believes are common across all languages, or at least the native language and also the target language. The accuracy of this belief is irrelevant because what is of concern is how the learner views the situation. Language neutral parts of language might include writing and conventions, certain aspects of semantics, stylistics, and or is certain grammatical structures. It is reasonable to assume that without prior knowledge, a prototypical speaker of English brings to language learning situation the belief that all languages use commas, periods, quotation marks, question marks, and so on, in the same ways as they are used in English. Similarly, our same of English is likely to believe that all languages are able to express the semantic concept in this sentence. The ball rolled down the hill. Our learner would probably begin with the assumption that learning to express this concept in a second language only involves learning the specific lexical items and appropriate word order of the language being learned. So, from the domain of syntax, there are also structures in second language to which learners most likely expect to find translation equivalents. So, this simple structure, like the sky is blue, is not likely to be considered structures that other languages do not have. So, on the other extreme of the continuum are language specific items. These are elements that the learner views as unique to his or her language. Included in this category are a great deal of the syntactic structure of a language, much of the phonology of a language, idioms, inflectional morphology, slang expressions, and collocations. So, syntactic structure refers to the syntax, a branch of linguistics that deals with the grammatical arrangement of words and morphemes in the sentences. So, phonology, of course, is the study of speech sounds in a particular language. And then, idioms are a group of words established by usage of a language as having a meaning peculiar from those of the individual words. For example, when we use the sentence, it is raining cats and dogs, which means there is a heavy rain. Inflectional morphology. So, inflectional morphology is the study of processes including affixation and vowel change that distinguish word forms in certain grammatical categories, or in short, the change in word form. For example, the use of s, ed, ing. So, if it is used in a word, you say works, worked, working. So the S represents simple present, ED represents simple past, and of course ING represents the present continuous forms. Next would be the slang expressions. So um it is an informal language or specific words used by a particular group of people. For example, cat's pajamas, which means that something was excellent, exciting, or new. What else? Wallflower, when he describes a person who is shy. Don't have a cow. Used to try to calm someone down. Or this expression, which is actually common to us teenagers. Um, busted, uh, like that, which actually pertains to someone who is getting caught doing something wrong. Then lastly is the collocation, where it is made up of two or more words that are commonly used together in English. For example, the phrase to give someone advice. When used in the sentence, we say, the teacher gave us some advice on making the TOS, or the table of specifications. However, none of these categories are absolute. For example, idioms and collocations can be of different types, with some being more transparent than others. An idiom like kick the bucket would most likely be considered language specific by most people, given that the meaning of the composite cannot be determined from the meanings of the different words. So learners would not be expected to do a word-for-word translation of the idiom when using a second. Thus, an English speaker learning Italian would be unlikely to say something like this: Quel vecchio ha dato un calcio al secchio. In English, that old man kicked the bucket. On the other hand, a collocation like make a difference appears to be more transparent in meaning. Hence, our speaker might indeed be expected to say this: Quel libro ha fatto una differenza. In English, that book make a difference. That knowledge reflected in this continuum, representing how one views one's own native language in terms of language specific versus language neutral items, is known as a learner psychotypology. So, psychotypology is the way in which a language learner perceives differences and similarities between languages, affecting how the learner communicates in those languages. So, Killerman used this term to refer to the learner's perceptions of language distance. He claimed that learners' perception of native language to target language distance was important for transfer. Learners were gradually finding out what they could transfer and what they could not. The closer the two languages, so please take note that the two closer um, the closer the two languages, the more could theoretically be transferred successfully, though there were important constraints which learners appear to impose on the transferability of items. Learners' psychotypology was not fixed. Rather, it was revised as they obtain more information about the target language. Thus, Dutch learners of German may start out with the assumption that the target language is very similar to their mother tongue, but later on come to adjust this perception as they organize the many differences. However, the language-specific or language-neutral continuum is not intended to be absolute. An additional important variable is perceived language distance. Languages that are closely related may influence learners in their beliefs about what is language neutral and what is language specific. Whereas we suggested earlier that phonology may be considered language specific, this may only be the case for learners learning very dissimilar languages. For example, Japanese speakers learning Polish, Spanish speakers learning Italian may consider all of their native language phonology as being the same as that of the target language phonology. Hence, in this learning situation, we would expect to find much more transfer. So this would be um, seen in the figure 5.5 schematized version of Kellerman's model of language transfer. So the x's there indicate that the extent to which the native language is expected to influence the second language. What is crucial is that the degree of language closeness is based on the learner's perception of both the distance. This is not necessarily the actual language distance between the languages and on the learner's perception of the organization of his or her native language. That is the extent to which parts of one's language are considered language neutral or language specific, and the extent to which the determination of language specificity is rigid or is susceptible to change based on the perception of language distance. So, in an empirical study, Killerman, 1979, attempted to show how intuitions of native language semantic space are used to predict translatability of items, in this case, of various meanings of single lexical item, from which one can infer transferability. So, to determine native language influences, Kellerman gave Dutch learners of English a list of Dutch sentences that with various meanings of the word breken, which means to break, and asked them which of the translation equivalents they thought could be used in English. What Kellerman found was that the concept of coreness was important. So coreness is basically determined by a combination of such factors or frequency, literalness, concreteness, and listing in a dictionary. And considering lexical items with multiple meanings, we can differentiate between core meanings and non-core meanings. So core meanings are those that are most frequently used. He broke his leg, she broke his heart, have literal meaning. He broke his leg are concrete rather than abstract, the cup broke, and are listed first in a dictionary or at the first to come to mind. It is unlikely that any dictionary would give the meaning in his voice break, his voice broke when he was 13 as one of the first meanings of the verb to break. Similarly, a teacher, when asked to explain the meaning of break in class, is unlikely to use the sentence, the news story broke at 6 o'clock as the first attempt at definition. Core meanings are likely to be equivalent to language neutral items, whereas the non-core meanings are likely to be equivalent to language specific items. So what does this say for a theory of transfer? So to answer this question, we consider figure 5.6, revised model of language transfer. And then again, the X there indicate those areas where we are likely to find native language influences. Thus, in probabilistic terms, we can predict where transfer will and will not occur. The greatest likelihood of transfer is in core elements regardless of perceived distance. So the second area of probable transfer is between languages perceived as close. Example, Spanish or Italian, Dutch or German, regardless of the status of core versus non-core elements. So in summary, in predictability or selectivity, there are three interacting factors in the determination of language transfer. So first, a learner's psychotypology, that is, how a learner organizes his or her native language. Next, B, perception of native language to target language distance. And C, actual knowledge of the target language. Recent work on language transfer has added new dimensions to our understanding of the concept with notions conceptual transfer. So first we will going to know what is language transfer. So first, what is language transfer? So it is the replication of rules from our first language to the second language. So our knowledge and understanding of first language impact our understanding of second language. We can transfer grammar, vocabulary, syntax, semantics, spelling, morphology, pronunciation, structure, and culture to the second language. This process of language transfer is also known as linguistic interference, cross meaning, and first language interference. Language transfer explains different accents and what mistakes people make. Also, it can predict how quickly we can acquire a second language, taking into account similarities and differences between the two languages. So, our brain is already wired with linguistic rules that help us operate in our first language. When we try to learn a second language, we rely on these established rules and structures to guess how the new language works. For example, Korean sentences use a subject, then object, then verb structure, while English sentences follow a subject, then verb, then object structure. Thus, a Korean speaker of English may incorrectly say, I your cat saw. Japanese words don't allow two consonants next to each other, so a Japanese speaker of English may add a vowel to pronounce an English word more easily. Star might sound like sutar. Similarly, Spanish speakers tend to add e before words starting with s. Star would be it will be sound like estar, estar. While conceptual transfer refers to transfer semantic concepts. So Odlin, who in 1989 provided the first general summation of language transfer studies in more recent work, 2005 and 2008, has considered research on linguistic relativity as well as investigations of the transfer concepts and meaning. So, in a study by Odlin and Alonso Vasquez, 2006, the evidence indicates that what is seemingly a present or past perfect verb phrase can have distinct meanings in the interlanguage that vary considerably according to the learner's first language. Thus, while French-speaking learners of English tend to overuse the English perfect by referring to the past events, for example, I have gone to Rome last year, Spanish speakers often use the perfect in target-like ways. For example, I have gone to Rome a few times. In contrast to these groups, Turkish speakers often use the past perfect to refer to events that they have no direct knowledge of, as in, my friend had gone to Rome last year, while the same learners use the past simple for events that they do have direct knowledge of, as in, I went to Rome last year. The differences between the use of the perfect by French speakers and Turkish speakers reflect grammatical and conceptual meanings in their native language. So let us now proceed to second language processing. As the field of second language acquisition continues to develop, a greater emphasis has been on how learners process language. So, for example, Frank Mestri 2005 reviews studies that suggest different processing strategies between learners and native speakers, where the learners resemble native speakers of the first language rather than native speakers of the second language. She analyzes that the results of learners of French, native speakers of Spanish and of English, processing sentences such as saw the daughter of the woman who was leaving the shop. Each group of learners, both in English and Spanish, was divided into two levels of proficiency depending on their length of residence in France. Spanish and French native speakers each have a tendency to interpret who was leaving the shop as referring to the first noun phrase, the daughter, while English interprets the relative clause was referring to the second noun phrase, the woman. Beginning learners rely on their first language processing strategies as they comprehend these sentences, whereas more advanced learners, the English learners of French, move to a second language processing strategy and interpret the relative clause as referring to the first noun phrase. This suggests an important role for the first language processing when confronted with the second language. So, in a series of three experiments, Van Patten and Keating 2007 investigate the acquisition of tense processing by second language learners. They found out that learners begin with a universal processing principle and not with their first language processing strategy. Although they do abandon their first strategies with greater proficiency, um, Van Patten and Keating were contrasting reliance on adverbs as a way of interpreting tense, for example, last night, and finite verbs. It may be that with more complex syntax, as in the case of Frank mystery studies, a greater reliance on the first language may be found. So that would be all. This is Dell Maquiling saying, Laban lang English majors.